friends, hello and welcome to another Skype session. But this one's going to be a little bit different because at the moment we're in the coronavirus nonsense at the moment, and we're doing a series of interviews, after-hours sessions with different speakers. And so Matt isn't around at the moment, so I thought I'd bring on my buddy John. Now, John has been part of our San Diego C.S. Lewis group for a while, and he absolutely loves Till We Have Faces, and he was really excited to talk about it. But then the coronavirus thing happened, and we then had to cancel our remaining meetings. So I thought it would be fun to bring him on the show, and you get to meet someone from San Diego in our book club, and we're just going to chat freeform about Till We Have Faces, and I'm just going to let him fanboy about it for a while. So John, welcome to the show.
Hello, David. Thank you so very, very much for having me on. And actually, I discovered your book club through the Pints with Jack broadcast. And I thought, you know something, I live close enough to where I can make it down there. And it's just been wonderful going through, the Chesterton and now, Till We Have Faces with you and Marie and all the other wonderful people down there in San Diego.
Well, just to fill people in, who are you?
Oh, okay. So my name's John Marr. Sorry, I am a professor of music at Santa Ana College in Orange County. And I would say C.S. Lewis is by far my favorite author. I've read almost everything by him. I haven't quite gotten through all of Allegory of Love yet, and a few of his, some of his tougher works that are more difficult to find there. But I've read most of his stuff. I started when I was a child, and this was really kind of silly of me because I believe I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe around maybe fourth or fifth grade, and I liked it, but everybody else liked it, so I didn't read it, which was me just being rather silly, saying, well, just because everyone else likes it, I'm not going to, which is actually why I've never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I know that's on my to-do list. I know I need to do that, but later on in my adult life, I got back into Lewis. I believe I think it was the Screw Tape Letters, probably in my late 20s, or maybe mid-20s, and then I really understood it, and I got it, and I immediately read, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I read, Great Divorce, Mere Christianity, all of his essays, some of his diaries, his letters to children. I loved his Latin letters that he wrote to a priest over in Italy. I loved, and when I got to We Have Faces, I realized that was I don't say by far, but I think it's my favorite book by him because for me, as you've mentioned in the podcast, it's the last novel that he wrote also. In my humble opinion, this is C.S. Lewis firing on all cylinders. He brings so much stuff. As Andrew Lazo said, he brings so much stuff from his prior works into this. And the narrative, I just find amazing. And I read this at some point, I would say, I knew I was in my doctoral studies, so probably in my late 30s or early 40s. And by that point, I'd already read quite a bit, not a lot, not as much as, say, Matt, but a lot of medieval literature. I'd already read Aristotle, I read Plato, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't get all of them, but a lot of the references I did get. And I was just dumbfounded about how amazing it was. And I have to say, I've read this book numerous times and I still cry at the very end of it. What was your opinion? Because when we had met in San Diego last, you had not finished the book yet. So how did that hit you and Marie when you finished it?
It was really great and rather amusing. So I was pacing myself along with our episodes. So I would read the episode, I would read the chapter, then do the episode, read the chapter, then do the episode. And I didn't break that down until we got to part 2, just because I thought Marie might kill me if I tried doing that. So what we did is we read it over the course of 4 days. And I've got to say, I loved it. As soon as we began part 2, and you have the chapter where Orwell says that, okay, I wasn't telling the truth before, I see that now. Some of this I discovered through my writing, but we then go on and hear about what she discovered about Redival, the fact that Redival actually felt like she had been pushed aside when the Fox and then Psyche turn up. And then to find out from Ansit that she had basically been draining Bardia dry. I love those kinds of stories where everything is suddenly turned on its head. Or a story that you think you know, it actually turns out that you didn't. One of my all-time favorite musicals is Wicked, because it completely reimagines the story behind The Wizard of Oz. And who you thought was bad is actually good, and who you thought was good is actually bad. Something in that, it really appeals to me. So when we suddenly start having all of these things change, I'm really liking it. We then got a little bit concerned when all these visions begin. It's like, wait, what is going on here? And although it was really interesting, I think that was something that concerned both of us. We weren't quite sure what was going on here. And I think it really wasn't until chapter 4 when Orwell goes to the 3 walls and sees what were effectively the visions playing out and seeing that these were things that Psyche was doing, that it all started to come together in something of a cohesive manner. And in a recent episode, it won't be recent by the time I post this, but I commented that I was going through an Inklings book, and they were talking about Charles Williams and his doctrine of coherence and substitution. And that for me was when you go to the opticians and they slot in a lens and suddenly a whole lot of things become clear, that really helped me get my arms around what I thought Lewis was trying to say. And then we got to the very end, and when Orwell is writing her final paragraph, I start hearing St. Augustine in my head. And I start seeing the point that he was driving towards this entire time, that there had been this god of love who had been pursuing not just Psyche, but also Orwell. And she'd just been misunderstanding it and resisting it the entire time.
Right, and there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, that's one thing I did love though, is that you get the character of Redival, and I don't know if you remember when I think you said, like, I think it was you or Maria, I forgot because you're a unit now, but one of you said I don't like Redival, and I said Ansett just seems to be, and I said just wait, because you hadn't read part 2 yet. And what I do like those, and it happens in film sometimes, where you get a character like Redival who seems like she's just going to be very broad, just kind of this kind of archetype or stereotype. And you're right, part 2 humanizes her so much. And same thing with Ansett, where you realize that all of Orwell's issues with these women is what she was accusing the god of. The god of the mountain, and it was just it was amazing regarding the visions. I think I like that, because at that point you really don't know what's going on, but then neither does Orwell. And just to be in that bewilderment with her, where you're like, where is this going? And like I mentioned, she may be the most 3-dimensional character C.S. Lewis ever wrote, because I know there's been a complaint that, well, I don't like her because she does bad stuff. It's like, well, yeah, but that's all of us. I mean, the thing is, she is so relatable as a character there. And and then like the bit, and one thing I did like when she was at the trial, when she was presenting her accusations against the gods, is that at the end they said, if you have a further complaint, it'll have to go to a court more excellent than this, which is really interesting, because that does tie into the whole Greek notion of, the gods are not eternal, not necessarily all good, and there's something yet above them. I mean, I love the way he tied that in. But
and there's a very subtle sleight of hand as we go through the book towards the end, a transitioning from the gods. I remember when I first started really studying the pagan gods from a Christian point of view, actually now active in my faith, and seeing the world of difference between Aristotle's unmoved mover, Aquinas's ipsum esse, the God who precedes everything and is the foundation of reality and being itself, and what we get in Greek mythology, which are really just glorified Marvel and DC characters.
Correct, yes. That's correct.
And there's a subtle shift as you go through towards the end of the book, away from the just simple superpower heroes of the Greek gods to something else. And even in Orwell's own language towards the end, she calls him Lord.
Right. Exactly. And I just because I think I was probably the last generation that actually studied, because we studied the gods as kids in elementary school. So we had to know what they were in Greek. We had to know what they were in Roman. We had to know a lot of the stories. So a lot of that was very fortunate. So I grew up with a lot of these stories, and I knew who they were. Not to the level of like C.S. Lewis. I mean, his Discarded Image is really good as far as getting. Have you read that book yet?
Not yet.
Discarded? Okay, that's a really good explanation of how the medievals saw themselves and like their relation to the gods, and how interesting that how so much of the gods still play in our lives. Like Tinkerbell is basically she's Aphrodite, she's Venus, or I find that really, really interesting. And another thing I loved about his treatment of the gods is how he now, have you read The Abolition of Man yet?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. Okay. So how he talks about the Tao. Mm-hmm. The one thing that I also liked about his treatment of pagan religion is how he brings in Shintoism and Buddhism with, and I thought I saw him bringing that in with the statues of Ungit, where at first she's this rock, which is what you had in Shintoism, like in Japan, and then later.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I don't know a whole lot about that.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's going to be relevant.
It's much like kind of the other gods, like the god of the mountain, where in Shintoism you'd have these local gods and spirits and whatnot there. So in Japan, you'll see that usually around the summertime, they have these matsuris, or these festivals, in which they'll carry around this kami, or a shrine, and that's typically to the local god. Mm-hmm. And so, unlike like the god that we believe in, it would be kind of these local gods of the mountain, or god for this area, that area, and god like the river god, turnip god, or like, have you seen the film Spirited Away? Have you seen that anime yet?
No.
Should see it. It's a really good examination of Shintoism, and I didn't really know that. I actually took a course on that at another school. But so you'd have these localized gods, and then they'd be represented by a rock, and then when Buddhism moves in, from originally India, then China, then into Japan, they became more anthropomorphized, and I find that really interesting. I always find it interesting because, and I know that Tolkien didn't like it, but I just love how Lewis pulls from all these different traditions and throws it into his story, like the White Witch in the Chronicles. See, in China, black is the color of good, white is the color of evil. Mm-hmm. Red means you're loyal. So like in Chinese opera, if you have a character whose face is half black, half red, it means he's a good person and he's very loyal. And white is the color of death in Asia, not here. The West has a different. But I just love how he pulls, how Lewis just grabs stuff from everywhere and throws it in and makes it all work. That's one thing that I've always admired about him. I think is just amazing stuff there.
Definitely keeps you on your toes.
Yes, he does. Oh goodness. And then let's see. Just one more thing. I took some notes here. One thing I wanted to say about Orwell, about her. I know a lot of people don't like her as a character, but I did like her because she's relatable. But it also makes me think about the Screwtape letters, where Screwtape's telling Wormwood, he goes, "Believe me, 70 years is not a year too long to detach a man from the earth and make him a candidate for hell." And this is a good example, though, of somebody living of the opposite happening. Yeah. She lives a long time and she becomes a candidate for heaven. Also with the I also wanted, oh goodness, I just lost my train of thought there. But I just think and also how she has so much, even though she doesn't always do the right thing, she does have so much virtue that the gods can work with her in the end, because it's, again, like what Lewis said in the essay Screwtape Proposes a Toast, where he says, never forget for one moment that the great sinners are made of that same damnable material as the great saints. And so with a personality like Orwell's, mm-hmm. she can be a very good person, or she can be a very bad person. And I think it's interesting that even though she doesn't make the right decisions, there is some virtue building in her. So when the gods do get to work on her and they do start the surgery, as she says, it's a success.
And there's also just the desire for that virtue. And I think in large part we can thank the fox for that, because of all of his Greek education. Mm-hmm. Although in many ways he blinded her to the supernatural, he at least inculcated in her natural virtue, which then provides really good raw material for such the point when the gods really start working on her, suddenly all of that can be turned around. Because it was one of the questions that Matt and I had throughout is, how good actually is Orwell? Because she actually makes quite a lot of decisions that we actually quite like, and particularly towards the end of the book when she's trying to stay busy so she's not having to think about things. She's devoting her time to good, virtuous things to serve the people of Gloam. Mm-hmm. And even at that point, even though we didn't quite like her a whole lot, it was very hard to say, to speak badly of her, at least in that regard.
Yeah, correct. Well, and one thing I would say, one thing I disagree with you, lads, just a bit though. When she had Bata killed, I was okay with it because remember she had Bata killed because Bata was spreading gossip that was leading people to like the mines and torture chambers and stuff. So when she had Bata hanged, I kind of laughed. I'm like, oh, okay. I found that.
Well,
I found that.
if
that it
we
was
can
totally
trust her
just.
though, if we can trust her in her assessment that this is what was happening.
Well, I don't know if she'd have. Well, I guess we'd have to ask would she have had a motive to kill her otherwise. But
Well, she
when I heard
certainly
that
wasn't a
Bata was
fan of
hanged,
Bata, because don't forget she was a friend of Redaval.
right?
She had seemed to have made enough comments about the way Orwell appeared, her beauty or lack thereof. Yeah, I maybe I just don't like too many people being killed.
Well, it was a barbarian kingdom. I mean, she didn't free all the slaves, but she. Then I think that's Lewis just saying, this is still a barbaric kingdom. But the oh, and one thing I did want to talk about also, the one, and we even mentioned this in the book club, was the where she sees the castle. She sees the castle of Cupid, and she still doesn't believe. It's interesting. There is an essay that made me think of his essay is from God in the Dock. It's not the book Miracles. It's an essay called Miracles where he talks about. He said there was a woman one time. He said I've only met one person who ever saw a ghost, and she doesn't believe that she really saw a ghost because she's an atheist. And so his point is seeing is not believing. And I think he may have been unpacking that just a bit with the fact that she saw the castle because that's what we all said at the book club. It's like, well, wait, you're right. She was on her knees. She had her veil off. She drank the water and she saw the castle. The first thing the rest of us would have done would have been, I want to do that again. And what did I see? And let's unpack this further. But she just ignored it because of, her worldview, which, as you mentioned, was, heavily influenced by the Fox, which I think that's another one of Lewis's surrogates for the Great Knock. Do you think? Kind of Professor Diggory?
Certainly in large part. Because he's certainly strongly opinionated, and we definitely get that impression from the Great Knock. He liked disputation, which is something that the Knock also did. I think so. I haven't dug enough into it. My knowledge of Greek philosophy isn't as strong as it should be, particularly when it comes to things like Stoicism. But he also seemed to be nudging us towards some question relating to Stoicism and Platonism. Because when Psyche was on the eve of her marriage, execution, whatever you want to call it, she alludes to what I'm pretty sure is Plato, that there are some other Greek teachers who say things differently from the Fox, the idea that death is a doorway. And I was wondering if he was perhaps saying that Stoicism is good as far as it goes. There's a lot of compatibility between Christianity and Stoicism in many, many, many things. But at the same time, Platonism would get you further. And to quote The Last Battle, Plato, it's all in Plato. What do they teach them at these schools?
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten that quote. That's a very good point there. I can't comment much on it because of my lack of knowledge of those subjects there.
I'm actually reading a book that Andrew Lazo recommended because every Saturday he is now reading Till We Have Faces on Facebook Live and then answering a few questions. Ooh. And he mentioned one commentary book called Bareface. Doris T. Myers is the author, and I'm going through that at the moment, and I have seen in the table of contents at the end, she does have sections where she talks specifically about Platonism and Stoicism, so I should know more soon.
Very good, very good.
So we sort of talked through chapter 1, so that was all of the revelation that everything was off. Chapter 2, that's when the visions begin. Mm-hmm. And is that the one where they start digging down through the pillar room? Or have I got them mixed up?
I forget which chapter it is. I just know it's in part 2 when she meets her father, and it's interesting that he shows up at the end because her father I never liked.
I have a theory about this. One, I think there's a little bit of commentary related to Freud in this because Lewis definitely knew his Freudianism and commented quite a good deal on it. But also, a lot of Orwell's best and worst qualities come from her father. If you think about her temper, it definitely comes from her father. But I would also suggest that some of her better qualities also come from him. in terms of the guy is dynamic. The guy can go to war and lead. And this is also something that Orwell can do. And I might be projecting a little bit here because I had a complicated relationship with my own father. And particularly when I started seeing more of him in me, both good and bad, that was something I really had to wrestle with. And so I actually think it's quite appropriate that she's doing this with her father, particularly since she is, for the majority of her life, she stepped into his shoes. She was the ruler of this kingdom. And also he was there from the beginning of her life, and in many ways they have to sort of go all the way back, dig down deep and down to get back to the core issues that began long before we really even barely pick up the story.
That's a good point. Kind of like the Pilgrims. Have you read the Pilgrim's Regress?
No.
Okay.
There's an annotated version I'm going to get at some point that's going to explain to me what all of the allegories point to.
Oh, okay.
Some of them seem obvious enough, but other ones was like.
Oh, but if you read the Pilgrim's Regress, it's kind of cool because Lewis actually has a commentary above each page as far as what's going on with the main character. But that's. Oh, I don't want to. Well, I guess you know there's a regress. I guess that's not a spoiler for you. Okay, yeah. So that's what I was getting at there because I don't want to spoil the book for you. But it is interesting because that is the only time she said she ever admired her father is when one time he got his armor on and he went out to go do battle because the rest of the time he was rather useless. And I have to say I found it very humorous that when he dies, she says if I take this correctly, he died seeing his daughter and two men ransack his armor for a battle that he himself should have fought. And I thought, whoa, that's a real. And Lewis, I think, is just so far ahead of the curve as far as writing like these really strong like female characters that would do stuff like this. Because it's of course I guess maybe with like Xena, was it Xena, the warrior princess Xena, that old show from the 90s, and it kind of started there. Now it's really big, and I always wondered is like why hasn't Hollywood made a movie of this because it is such an amazing story. And I think if anything this would be because sometimes I hear the level of sexism charged against Lewis, and I'm like, well, I don't think you've read this book because I think it's very telling when at one point she says the one sin the gods never forgive us of is that of being a woman. It was like, whoa. I mean, coming out of him from the 1956. That's very prescient. I
have a very strongly held soapbox topic on this because I was actually talking fairly recently about Captain Marvel and how much I hated it, but then about Wonder Woman and how much I loved it. And the reason I loved it, and the reason why I think that movie works, whereas Captain Marvel was a snooze fest, aside from the fact that it was a prequel, was the fact that with Wonder Woman, we get to see her vulnerability. She isn't just this infinitely powerful being who can do no wrong and make no mistakes. We see her heart. We see the mistakes that she makes. We see her crying when she can't help everybody that she wants to help, when someone that she loves is about to die and sacrifice himself. It's when you see that's attractive and strong. And I would say that's one of the reasons perhaps why this hasn't been made thus far, because you have to have a strong female character who isn't just an all-powerful being, who is someone who is deeply flawed, and even more so because you only really start rooting for her right near the end.
Right, and I have to say, just as from one Christian to another, that's one thing. One thing that disappointed me about Wonder Woman, although I did like the film, is that when the big bad does show up at the end, because she's looking for this god of evil, and at one point, or this god of war, excuse me, and at one point, Steve Trevor tells her, he goes, "No, well, this is us. We're doing this. It's not a god. Humanity's doing it to itself. Don't look for some outside. Oh, there's something out there in the universe that's controlling us." I really found that to be really telling. So when the bad guy showed up at the end, I was kind of like, it was disappointing. But all in all, I did like the film, even though it really did take quite a bit from Casablanca at the end with the airplane bit and whatnot there, But I'm sorry.
And also, why does the bad guy still have to have an English accent when he's fighting her? Come on.
Because you guys sound so cool. But I've never met an evil Englishman. They're always fun. But I guess maybe it's the exoticism of Although the bad guys always have accents. Maybe it's because it doesn't. We could say, oh well, it's because he's British or German or whatever. He's not one of us. So I don't know. So terribly sorry. But but we really admire your accent.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Well, then let's talk about let's talk specifically about her court case. So she's she's in the desert. She comes to the mountain covered in scorpions and lots of horrible things, and then she's taken down inside, and she gets to read her complaint against the gods. What thoughts did you have about that?
Well, it's a lot of it's kind of, I think there's a musical. I've never seen it, but I just remember that the name of it is called Your Arms Too Short to Box with God. And so she had this complaint because she had this script, and that, I mean, I think one of the amazing things about the book is that, or one thing I should, maybe not amazing, but I found so moving, is that it starts off, I am old now. So this is a woman at the end of her life, at the end of her rope. And she goes, here's my complaint against the gods. And after all this writing and recounting and recording, whatever, she takes it, and it just seems so small and insignificant. And then she reads it, and then she doesn't realize that she's been reading it again, and it's just the same thing again and again and again and again, which is really one of from my pastors and like Bible teachers. That's just what the devil is. It's just the same thing again and again and again and again. I mean, like when Satan tempts Jesus, is basically the same thing 3 times. It's like there's no variety. It's just one thing, and it's just it's just monotonous, really. And I found that to be so interesting, because at the end of it all, she says, well, here's what I got to say, and da-da-da-da-da. And in light of everything else, it's like, when you actually get presented with it, it's like, I mean, it's God. I mean, at the same time, because, as somebody who, deals with, I'm a musician, so, you get a lot of the protest stuff from the 60s. And I go, yeah, we're going to rail and scream. I get, I got this big electric rock band. It's okay. Let's turn off the electricity. Now how? You need electricity? You didn't make the electricity. That came from the universe. So it came from God. You did not create it. You can harness it. You can't create it. All you can do is use it, and we can scream as much as we want at God. But I mean, it's just, I think it always hammers into me is that, what we go through, and not that there isn't bad. I mean, of course there's evil and whatnot there, but at the end, all of our screams and protestations, that a lot of it is like she said, she looked at it and it just seems so insignificant. And I think sometimes in my life, especially when I get, depressed and whatnot there, I look at what some other people have gone through, and you kind of get some perspective. Because I was talking to a colleague about this, and she said, oh, isn't this the worst case scenario? I'm like, well, no, because I know somebody who lived through the Khmer Rouge massacre under the communists in Cambodia. It could be a lot worse than this, And I mean, that was my big takeaway from that, how she'd read it and she just kept repeating it, and she didn't know she was repeating it. She just kept repeating it, kind of like Palaleya, and just goes on and on and on. And then finally, I love the reading with Nadia May, the audiobook. She's like, that's enough. And then it's like, be quiet. Have you been answered? And she realizes that in giving her complaint, she had been answered. I mean, that was just, that's one, because like you say, the part 1 is so huge, and part 2 is like, well, what's he going to do with these 4 small chapters? That's where, like, in my opinion, C.S. Lewis just, bats it out of the park with bases loaded. I don't know what the cricket equivalent would be. I'm terribly sorry, David. Maybe you could make up a better.
It was a perfect 6. I don't know. I have never really played much cricket. It seems an incredibly dull, boring sport to me. Oh. But yeah, the amount that he packs in those chapters is incredible. And yeah, I think it's quite a lot of this book really speaks to really the two best arguments for atheism, and they're really 2 different kinds of the same sort of argument. One is the problem of pain, and one is the problem of divine hiddenness. But I see in that scene, it reveals the truth that very often it's not so much the problem of evil, it's the problem of this evil I'm currently experiencing. So Orwell's chief complaint is, you stole Psyche, I don't like that. And over the course of book 1, she has tried to dress that up in so much more. But that, when you boil it down, that's really, really the root of her complaint. I wanted to keep Psyche for myself, and I didn't want to share her. And you won her heart. Right. And when she says, there should be no thought in that girl's head that I did not put in there myself. You're right. It's just really, and I believe, I think it was Andrew Lazo, or I believe, or maybe with you and Matt, where they mentioned how, like, it's a twisted storge. Yeah. And then there could be a twisted eros, and there could be a twisted philia, because in the 4 loves, basically, without agape,
the other three loves all go bad. And I totally agree. And what's interesting is how everything she accuses the gods of, she has done to others. Because I mean, I've had that with people too. They said, I had one person who had, got busted for drunk driving, and she was supposed to go to these classes, and then this person said, well, I wouldn't go because the person was being too prideful and stuck up. And I'm like, well, what does it tell me? What does it tell the person? If you're not going to go to the class, you did something wrong. And this is how you create restitution. Go to the class.
Also, what did Lewis say about pride? It's that sin that we really hate when we see it in other people, usually in proportion to our own pride.
Well, and we don't, and pardon me, but we don't have it much I'm not a Protestant, but in the Protestant tradition, but I know the 7 deadly sins. Pride is usually number 1. And I've talked to my students over the years, and it's interesting because pride is always number 1. Different Catholic traditions, and correct me if I'm wrong, the other 6 can be in different order, but pride is always the number 1 sin. It's really interesting. So because I know there's a kind of a Western version, there's like an Eastern European version, but pride
is always first.
Well, it's how we get all the rest.
Yeah.
We know better.
So after the court case, that's when we find out that the king is in the underworld and he wants to punish Orwell. So that wasn't particularly encouraging. It was good to see that he hadn't changed at all.
I know. What do you take of the king and the fox being in the underworld? That was interesting. It was interesting to see them come back.
Well, I can synthesize that actually very happily with Christianity, because this is prior to Christ, therefore the gates of heaven haven't been opened, so there is just Sheol and the different areas in Sheol. And I also then marry that with what Lewis said about when he was speaking about virtue and vice, heavenly and hellish creatures, that pretty much just how we are setting ourselves up in life will just continue for all eternity. And since there was no obvious deviation in the king over the course of his life, it seems to have just carried on into eternity. He seems to be just as mean and vindictive as before. Whereas the fox, we see some theosis happening, because he wants to step, very Christ-like, he wants to step into Orwell's place to claim the fault to fall upon himself. And he says, you can send me to Tartarus if that'll cure glibness. So he seems to see that as his chief sin. And it was the thing that kept him blinded from the supernatural, because he was just glib about it. Lies of poets, lies of poets.
Right. Well, and it goes back to what screw tape letters with, there's humor. It takes a smart man to make a joke about anything, but anybody can be flippant.
Yes.
But I'm sorry. So, and then as far as the king and just digging, and I just see that, like you said, she's digging into her psyche, and it's interesting how it gets smaller and smaller and darker and hotter as the further she goes down. And I started thinking of things like, well, maybe actually I hadn't thought of Sheol. That's interesting. I was thinking more of oh goodness, I wasn't even thinking of Hades really, because Hades is where you forget who you are. So it's not quite the same as what Lewis was doing. Yeah,
I think those divisions between mythologies and Christianity start really starting to blur at this point.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question I asked Andrew, and
sure.
I'm pleased to say he thought the same thing as me. Who do you think the judge is?
Well, that's what I found interesting about the judge. The judge recognizes that there may be something, a court. So he's whatever he is. He may be the Ninth Court Circuit of Appeals or whatever, because there's somebody above him. So I just take him to be another one of the gods. I don't know. I guess Jupiter or Zeus, but I really don't know. But what's interesting though, whoever he is, there's somebody who stands above him, which I find to be very interesting. So even at this point with the visions and everything with Orwell, she's still going through a process. She's not at the final place yet, at least in my opinion. That's how I see it, because the fact that the judge says if she wants to continue her complaint, it will have to be tried at a court more excellent than this one. So I really hadn't thought of it. I mean, I'm just guessing. But what's your opinion?
That's a very interesting objection, actually, to what Andrew and I both suggested, that perhaps this is the god of the mountain, but veiled. That the superior court isn't because there is a better judge, but because you can see the judge more clearly.
I don't know.
Because he certainly, this person certainly seems to be just, and to have some level of authority. So, I'm not sure.
But one thing I did like about that portion is where she asks, "Oh, grandfather, are the gods just?" He goes, "No. What would become of us if they were?" And so he's putting that grace in there, which I did really like. So I'd have to.
And the very strong echo from The Great Divorce, when you've got the self-righteous ghost says, "I've got to have my rights. I don't want anyone's bleeding charity."
Right. Really, that's all we have. But yes.
And then the fox takes her to this garden, so to call it, and we see all of these visions. What I loved about that was, particularly in the final vision, when you see Psyche going down to the underworld to collect beauty. And we see, first of all, the crowd try and draw her away, then the fox try and draw her away, and then someone else. And immediately I thought, oh, this is going to be Orwell. But then Orwell says that she doesn't recognize that person. But then we see the bleeding hand. It's like, oh my goodness, Orwell didn't even recognize herself.
Right. Well, and I wasn't quite sure whether to take that as something that really happened, or that was a vision that Psyche was having. So it's it reminds me of and you'd have to remind me of it because but in The Great Divorce, remember, where there's kind of like this third person point of view. You're looking at what you're near the end of the book. Remember, where they're actually looking at like what they're doing.
You mean of the chess game?
The chess game, that bit there, where they're actually looking upon what they had done. And it's interesting because at that point it's not entirely clear what's happening, and I'm okay with that because, as the god said, you shall also be Psyche. So part of that was was it a vision? I mean, I believe that's what Psyche did. Whether that was really Orwell doing it or just kind of an avatar of Orwell, I've never really decided if that was really herself, or was this like some avatar, some version of her that was trying to distract Psyche.
Okay, so I just had the interview with Andrew this week, and this is what I pitched for him, and he didn't disagree as far as I was concerned, that this is Charles Williams and his idea of coherence, because we're told in Till We Have Faces that, because Orwell asks the fox, did this really happen? And he says, yeah, Psyche really did this, but another one bore much of it, bore the anxiety of it. And so what I think all of this is that Orwell unknowingly was mystically participating with the challenges that Psyche was going through, the challenges given to her by Venus. And so the idea of coherence and substitution, it was originally used in patristic literature to describe the persons of the Trinity, that they co-inhere in one another. One God, one essence, three persons. So that there's coherence of those persons. But then you also have the body of Christ, that the hand can't say to the foot, I have no need of you. The fact that in the body of Christ, we are all members of one another, joined in a very inextricable way. And the exhortations of Scripture to carry one another's burdens. And Charles Williams just took that and ran with it. And he had the idea, well, let's do that. And the idea that you could mystically carry someone else's burdens, in the same way that when Joy was sick with cancer, Lewis said to his friends, I wish I could carry her pain, some of her pain. And he prayed that he would be able to do that. And as Joy starts getting better, he starts getting worse. And so what I think is happening with Orwell and Psyche is that Psyche is performing the tasks given to her by Ungit, Venus, whatever you want to call her, but that Orwell is carrying some of the burden of this, which is actually quite fitting since she was the cause of a lot of it.
Right. And that's really interesting. I like that. I'll have to go. I read his book, Battle in Heaven, about 4 years ago. I need to go back and reread it now with that in mind. When I saw that, what I thought of was, have you read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy?
Yes.
And I found it interesting because, you'd have separate chapters like, okay, here's what happened. And the next chapter, here's what was going on in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that to be really interesting that he takes it's like one event, but he looks at it from two separate point of views. And that's how I saw that. That's how I kind of saw that scene there where she was doing the, tasks set upon her. I just saw it as Lewis saying, okay, here's physically, here's what was happening. Psychologically, here's what was happening. And the physical stuff happened to Psyche. The psychological stuff happened to Orwell. But of course, there was, or I should say, most of the physical stuff happened with Psyche. Most of the psychological stuff happened with Orwell. That's how I saw it. But I like your opinion or your take on it.
And that thinking actually made me wonder whether, when we're told that Orwell tried to kill herself, I asked Andrew. He thinks that she really did try and do that, but in all of the other pictures, the things that happen, that they actually happen to Psyche.
That's a good, right, you're correct.
And
yes.
So in the same way that later in the book, she doesn't necessarily realize that she is having a vision. She just walks straight into it. Part of me wondered, is when she goes to go and throw herself into the Shenet, was that actually really happening, or was she having one of these mystical participation visions where this is what was really happening to Psyche?
Right. Well, that's what I also loved about that scene is where, the God says, don't do it. And then when she sees herself, she sees the vision, she says, don't do it. And so that's where I like your idea, but that's when I started, I hearken back to Surprised by Joy, where I'm like, whoa, because this is, it's like she's commenting on herself. And but this is the brilliance of Lewis, where you're like, I may not always understand it, but boy, I always admire him, and when stuff is not spelled out for me, specifically where I know what's going on, and we can, have these discussions like what you said with coherence, which I need to dig into now. That's what I love about this stuff, is because it's not like, here's what happened, think this, and then it was over. There's a lot of room for for this uncertainty, which is okay. I don't need to have answers for everything, but I do like your perspective on it.
Yeah, one person from our book club didn't like the ending. It's like, oh, just say what you mean. I just stop making this more complicated.
Well, but then there's not quite as much to discuss then, I think.
And I'd also say Lewis wouldn't then be doing what I think he was trying to set out to do when he was writing this book. He's trying, in our searching to try and understand what's going on, we start stumbling onto the same mistakes that we make.
Mm-hmm.
And it ultimately comes down to that there is this God of love who is pursuing us, and we would prefer to do anything other than be pursued.
Correct. Yeah, the hellhound of heaven, as he said it. Or no, or the hound of heaven.
The hound of heaven.
Hound of heaven, excuse me. Yes, not the...
Hellhound of Heaven, that's probably
a
cheap B movie.
Right.
But after they've seen all of the visions, Psyche then comes out and Orwell then comes out and she meets Psyche, falls at her feet. And I loved that, particularly that it gets my Catholic juices going, because it's a wonderful thing that's articulated there, that she realizes that she loves Psyche more than she has ever loved her before. And yet, she now sees in so many ways she's nothing, and that even Psyche now points to something else. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, when we love the saints, we love them more than we can imagine. But even that actually points to something else, because there was something else that made Psyche great. And in this case, it's the God of love, who she then meets afterwards. Mm-hmm. And I during this time, when everyone is at home, I've got ahead on all of my interviews, and I interviewed Dr. Lepoyavi, and he's written a lot about Lewis and love, and in his most recent research he's digging into the different kinds of worship. In Catholic theology we talk about dulia, hyperdulia, and oh my goodness, what's the other one? Either way, it's basically honor, lots of honor and worship. And what's the difference between each of them? And he couches it, we're really talking about love here, and different degrees and different kinds of love. And so he takes that and applies when we love relationships into, well, what is the love that is due to God, and what is the love that human beings are due.
Mm. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, but I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
And I was just going to say, and then after she's met Psyche, she's taken to the pool, and then she then meets Psyche's husband.
Mm.
And if they ever do make a movie on this, the hard cut in that when she's then suddenly finds herself back in the garden, and it's just going to be amazing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I always thought
it's like, what? No, we were just there.
I think that would be amazing. But one thing I always thought when I read the book, one movie thought that I thought that would be kind of cool, which would deviate from the book a bit, was when she was talking with Ansett at the end, and she said, and then she gets furious with her, and she said, I was going to have her hanged, actually have a scene where it shows, the trial, Ansett, some kangaroo court, she's actually getting hanged, and then cut back to Orwell still sitting in the room with Ansett saying, I grieve with you, dear lady, and she just walks off, she could have hanged Ansett, but she didn't. I always thought that would have been something they could add for the film. So if Hollywood makes a movie, man, you'd actually get like some kind of producer's credit or something,
Just as long as I get to visit the set and walk around Glome, I'll be good.
Exactly.
And then the book wraps up with Orwell doing her writing, finishing up what was being said, and as I mentioned earlier, for me it just seemed. I heard St. Augustine in that final paragraph when he speaks about his search for God, and he went looking in all the wrong places and getting lost in the things that were created rather than the creator, which is idolatry and distorted love. They're one and the same thing.
And I mean, I would, for me, the ending. I didn't make that connection. So I'll be quite honest. The thing I loved that was like, long did I hate you, long did I despise you, and then it cuts off, and then I might, and then Arnott, the priest,
Arnhem,
Arnhem. I was thinking, mixed him up with Ansett. When Arnhem writes, this, and then when he writes the eulogy for her, that's just heartbreaking. Where he said, here is the most just, kind queen that Glome has ever seen, and he's read the whole book. I mean, he's read everything. He's read everything she's done wrong, and at the same time, that's an interesting point of view too, because she sees it. She says, here's everything. I did this wrong. That was terrible. And Arnhem says, "You're the best we've ever had," which again goes back to my my take on the book, where like even though she was doing some bad things, she was building virtue through that time, and when she died the most beloved queen of Glome. But that's when I break down.
And it also reminds us that you can only truly judge something at the very end to see where you ended up.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting because that was that kind of as far as a genre, like the novel came into being in I think the 19th century. Okay, that's what I've been told, or 18th century, and the idea of like following one's life until death, and then looking back and reflecting upon it happened then. And we even do that now in the sense that, I mean, as soon as a musician dies, boom, we start listening to that musician. So like, Frank Sinatra dies, everybody listens to Frank Sinatra, and then Michael Jackson dies, we listen, and then, Prince and Bowie, we lost too many, quite frankly. But that's a very, and I find it to be kind of an interesting, interesting thing we've just acquired as a people, is that we do wait. You're right. Look at the very end, get to the end, and then look back at the person's life. And it's too bad people don't pay more attention to us before that. But hey.
Well, I heard Matthew Kelly give an analogy when he spoke about judging someone. He said it's the equivalent of getting a movie reel, back in the days when things weren't digital, getting a movie reel and cutting out one frame and saying that, this is Casablanca. Or this is the Shawshank Redemption. It's like, no, it's really not. It's one small piece. Right. But if you want to understand it, you need to see all of it.
That's a good point. I like that. It's a good analogy.
Also, the Shawshank Redemption is the best movie ever made. One man's humble opinion.
I don't know if I have my favorite all time. I don't. I just saw I just showed my class the Long Good Friday yesterday. Have you seen that?
Mm-mm.
Oh, it's considered the greatest London movie ever. It's a Cockney gangster film.
Okay.
Bob Hoskins, love it. But
Oh yeah, yes. I remember when he did a few gangster movies in quick succession. Don't know what was going through his life at the time.
Well, he was typically a gangster. He was usually in these gangster films. So when he showed up in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I'm like, oh my gosh, watch out! It's Bob Hoskins. Someone's going to get beaten up, because he's always playing these gangsters and toughs and stuff. But that's
so that was more of his tradition. See, when I was growing up, the first Bob Hoskins movie I ever saw was Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
So I'd already seen Long Good Friday and Mona Lisa by then, so I was used to him playing thugs. So
okay. So the guns he was shooting weren't animated.
Exactly. Yeah.
Feeling frisky, boys. So as we wrap things up, any other thoughts about Till We Have Faces?
Oh my goodness. Well, like I said, thank you for doing. I mean, if anything, it's wonderful that you've brought so many guests onto Pints with Jack, because I need to get on reading some of these commentaries on Till We Have Faces, because years ago I was listening to a philosophy professor, and he said, when it comes to like Plato's Republic, don't get bogged down with the commentary. There's libraries of commentary. The Republic is a little small book. Just read that, But it is good to get some perspective, and it's wonderful to get these different opinions from all these guests you've had on your show. So thank you for that. That gives me more stuff to research, and especially when Andrew Lauza said he thinks, I guess he knows more about Till We Have Faces than anyone. Sounds like a challenge. So hey, I'll see what I can do.
Well, we've had a couple of recordings now, and I've mentioned some things. He says, "Oh, that's good. I'm gonna write that down and not cite you."
Right. Well, we have it on the podcast now, so
exactly. This will be my evidence.
Amen, brother.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and please give my best to Matt.
I will. And listeners, you can join us again next Tuesday when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.